6:33. Very good morning to you, watching and listening to Breakfast with Stephen and Ellie.
Let's take
all these messages. I've just been followed by the Nolans.
How fun is that?
The Nolans. What was that big hit before your time?
Yeah, I can't help you with that one, darling. But that's fun, though.
It's fun.
Yeah.
Morning, Nolan sisters.
If you're watching, he's a big fan.
How exciting.
Can't think of his songs right now, but he's...
There's the big one when I was a kid. You'll
be able to help him out.
GBNEWS at gbnews.uk. Okay, let's talk to Ella Whelan, who's joined by Benedict Spence this morning to take us through our papers, our Sunday papers. Good morning, both of you two.
Morning.
Ella, let's kick off with the Mail on Sunday, should we? With the Prime Minister getting embroiled, sort of, in the Lineker row.
Sort of is the important word there, isn't it? But I mean, you know, it's interesting that I think, like a lot of things today, something small happens. I mean, obviously the suspension of Gary Lineker isn't necessarily small, but one event happens and it starts to snowball, and then it becomes about something much, much bigger. So this really isn't actually about Gary Lineker tweeting any longer. It's about sort of impartiality in the BBC more broadly, whether or not there's a problem with Tim Davies, whether or not there's a problem with now, as the Mail reports, Rishi Sunak. At least commenting, you know, he could have said, "This isn't my business. Nothing to see here. This is the BBC's business." He did say, you know, actually, this is an issue for the BBC. I'm not going to comment on it. However, please let me defend my policy on asylum and blah blah blah. So, effectively, it was him wading in, and I think a lot of people will see that as a problem. There has been, you know, in relation to sort of legislation that's been brought in or at least brought up in Parliament in the last few years in terms of intervening into what kind of stuff newspapers can print, what kind of stuff can happen online, what stuff can be broadcast. Nadine Dorries, when she was in her position under Boris Johnson as Culture Secretary, constantly kind of pushing for Ofcom to get more involved in what people could say online, what people could say on air. And I think all of that feeds a kind of cynicism amongst a certain section of people who think that there is a bit of a stink going on at the BBC. But the interesting thing about the BBC impartiality row is you can find as many people who think that it's left-wing loony land as you can people who think it's all right-wing, you know, Nazi reheated kind of thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like the comments about obviously the chairman and his relationship with Boris Johnson. Tim Davie used to be a Conservative councillor, so I'd also say, well, it's all protecting the right wing. They don't want to upset the government. Well, except as you say, everyone else says, the coverage is really lefty.
And you know, I think probably there was, I'll stick my neck out, even though I'm a big fan of the BBC, and say that probably around issues like Brexit, there was a problem with impartiality, and there was a problem with reporting. There are, you know, something like, there are rules that the BBC has, that it's, you know, whether or not Gary Lineker has kind of in the round broken them is a sort of technical question, but I think a more interesting question is whether or not, you know, this brings up the issue of free speech, and it brings up the issue of being, you know, whether or not people should be cancelled, because I suppose he would be sort of cancelled if this happened. And with all of that in the balance, even though I think he's a bit of an idiot, I would defend Gary Lineker on this issue, and I don't think he should have to step down or be pushed out.
And Benedict, it is really interesting, isn't it, the way that the papers are covering it today. It's turning on the BBC itself, the chairman and the Director General under pressure to resign. Tim Davie, the Director General, saying he will not quit.
And I think that's sensible. I mean, you know, just having it all out in the open, I think that a football presenter should be allowed to talk about politics and sort of thing at the BBC, but the BBC has its rules, it has its standards, and when you sign up to work for it, you understand what that is. I think if the BBC starts to cave, they can't cave to people who are, you know, effectively striking in solidarity. I think if senior figures walk over this, then it creates more trouble with the government later on down the line, I suspect, is actually what will happen.
So why is the BBC, according to the Sunday People, begging Gary to come back?
I think, well, there is an understanding that this has all created a very large storm, which is across almost literally every single front page, and it's not good publicity for the BBC. So you can understand why they want to sort of nip it in the bud. I'm sure they want to keep a hold of Gary Lineker. Personally, I am not of the opinion that he is irreplaceable, but obviously he is a figurehead. He is sort of totemic. You can understand why they want to, ease this out of the way. They want to get everything back to business as usual. So I can understand why a large organisation doesn't want to be sort of brusque and obtuse, and it does want to be seen as conciliatory, because it is not broadly seen as partisan or particularly aggressive. It is part of the national furniture, the fabric. It's supposed to be seen as quite a nice organisation. So that, I suspect, is probably why there is a keenness to get people back on side, get them all back to work, and everybody gets back to having a nice working relationship. But we do need to remember, this is not just the media, this is football. These are two very, shall we say, hyper-incentivized industries that reward people who are very ambitious. If this goes on for more than a couple of weeks, I think the screw will start to be tightened at the BBC, and people will start to have the pressure put on them to go back to work or be replaced. Because as much as there is people saying that they are speaking out in solidarity, there will be some very ambitious people who are looking at this and saying Gary Lineker is potentially just vacating being the face of BBC football coverage, and that could go to anybody else, and that's you made if you do that. And as much as people like Piers Morgan are saying, oh well, we'll see you if you decide to cross the picket line, and Danny Baker comes out and says you're a scab if you decide to work on this. Actually, football fans do not care. We saw this with the European Super League. Actually, the protests outside the clubs. Oh, it's a disgrace. We'll never watch you again. That didn't last very long. People will go back to watching their football clubs. They don't really care about this thing. They don't care if they're owned by fans or oligarchs. They don't care who's playing up front for them, if they've got a criminal record or not. That's actually the nature of the beast. And this time next season, this will all be forgotten about. So I think there is a very short shelf life that people like Gary Lineker can actually put pressure on the BBC before somebody goes, all right, it's time to move on. We've had a great run. If he doesn't want to do this anymore, fine. We will find someone else who can do this job.
I think he makes eye-watering amounts of money at the BBC at the moment. And
2 million, isn't it? Over 2 million.
He could triple it. He could if he went to a different station. So,
do you think he'll go?
Well, the interesting thing is there must be something going on at the BBC, or else it's a kind of wider test of what's happening in politics, that so many people are leaving. You have Andrew Neil, late of this parish, Emily Maitlis. You have a large kind of stream of presenters who are seeming to want to give up the constraints of the sort of impartiality rules of the BBC to go to channels where they can say what they think. Andrew Marr, for example, So there seems to be a bit of a trend in that. I suppose he has to judge whether or not he wants to leave the Match of the Day title, which is so important to him, he's done since the 90s, to tweet. I mean, also the thing to say is that, to tweet, and he's been pushing the line a lot. I mean, Gary Lineker is an annoying man on social media. Maybe if this chastens him a little bit,
I do have a little bit of sympathy in that, during the World Cup, it was pushed, there was talk about the political situation in Qatar, which a lot of people were very in favour of. And I think, given that football is a partisan sort of sport where people are expected to be partisan, and half of the point of punditry is to say things that are inflammatory and controversial. It's the only thing in the world, really, where you can have two sets of people watching the exact same event and saying that's a goal, that's not a goal, that's a foul, that's an offside, and fully believe it. How can you then have people who have been part of that industry their whole lives then say to them, but you have to be completely neutral on absolutely everything else? I just don't think it works.
And where is the line as well, which is where this conversation is going, isn't it? I mean, many people pointing to the start of the Qatar coverage, and there is a monologue from Gary Lineker on air expressing his concerns about the tournament being held there, but then when he tweets about...
But that's not about... Impartiality tends to be about the political situation in this country.
At home, yes.
Doesn't it? That's the thing.
And I think we all know that everybody has, if they're interested in politics and following politics, everyone will have their private biases. The question is, can you, in your job, put that to one side and allow people to breathe and have the space to present both sides? And so if he was interviewing Rishi Sunak on the weekend political shows, you might think, okay, this is completely inappropriate. But they're talking to Roy Keane and Ian Wright. They're probably not going to focus too much on the small boats issue, and so and neither of them have the power to enact policy in Parliament. So it's probably not such a big deal.
Yeah. Okay. Let us know what you think. gpviews@gbnews.uk. The tweets so far are against Gary, or the emails so far. If you support what Gary's doing, let us know. Let's look at much more important matters in the Observer, Ellie. Ella. Beg your pardon, somewhere Ellie came.
No, it's Ella and Ellie.
Ella and Ellie.
It's the danger of the dog.
Yeah.
I'm going to call you Elizabeth. That's your actual name, isn't it?
My full title.
The skinny jab.
This is really quite remarkable.
I've seen this everywhere.
So, people will remember that this...
I've ordered some.
Well, I was listening to it on the radio and I thought, God, if it would mean that I didn't have to get up and go running, things like that, I'd do it. And, there was this sort of a big push across different channels of, professors and experts and people working in the medical field talking about this skinny jab. And it turns out, as the Observer has revealed, that the drug company behind it, Novo Nordisk, actually paid out £21.7 million to institutes that were related to obesity, to charities, to individuals who were linked to organisations to effectively promote the drug. And they went on, there was a professor who went on to the Today programme, who was a former advisor to the drug company. He's linked to an organisation that was paid £3.6 million by the firm. The firm has to be said, I have to say, they say there's absolutely nothing wrong. There's not necessarily any rules being broken by this.
No.
But the important thing was that nobody knew. The listeners didn't know. I certainly didn't know. And I think probably if you had heard that this was more akin to a press release rather than a scientific invention, like the kind of, to me it sounded like, we've got a cure for arthritis or something like it was in line with that, rather than
a paid promotion.
I think it makes a difference, particularly because it's something in the realm of weight loss where we are so used to having different sort of quick fix solutions being pushed at us. But that being said, I also don't think, the world of science, and particularly the world of scientific innovation, does need to have funding. It does need to have this, money has to swill around in order to make things happen. So I wouldn't dismiss it outright, but it is just interesting that the Observer has revealed the kind of behind-the-scenes world of a lot of these sorts of health announcements.
Because this drug's been around for a very long time.
It's a diabetic drug.
It's a type. I remember because I used to do bits of work for Novo Nordisk because they make insulin and things, and they were telling me about this 15 years ago, saying they discovered it's a drug for type 2 diabetes, and they discovered it suppresses appetite.
Yeah.
They were saying, well, how do we? You've got to get it recommissioned and reapproved if you're going to then market it as something. It's like Viagra was for something else.
Yeah.
So it's. So they've been working on this for a very long time. But as you say, if people are giving interviews and things on it,
I think you need to disclose, or
disclose.
Yeah, because I
suspect this is a lot more common than people realise, and precisely because this industry it exists to make money. I know that in this country, because we think of the NHS as sort of being a taxpayer-funded free at the point of view thing, that people sort of view it as a charity, and that everybody doing research is doing it for the common good of man. Actually, they're not. That's not how these industries do work.
Oh no.
And I think especially actually post-pandemic, you will see a lot more of this sort of thing happening, because I think that there is a lot of distrust in certain parts of the medical community and the research community, simply by dint of the speed at which certain vaccines were rolled out, as much as anything else. And people, we do see this quite often, actually, people questioning the processes by which what were actually life-saving vaccines were just sort of forced through, and waivers were signed, by governments because there was just a desperation to get things done. I think that had a lot of benefit, but it did also create a lot of distrust in the medical community. So you will see more of this sort of thing as an effort to sort of improve the image of different companies and of different products that they sell.
Oh well.
Another side of the story is in America, where Ozempic and Wegovy and whatever name it's being branded under over there. There's now a shortage for diabetics, people who need it to treat diabetes. To treat type 2 diabetes, because there is such a demand for it as a weight loss drug. So I really hope that we don't see those sorts of shortages over here, which is the whole other side to that story.
They'll have to up production, won't they, significantly?
Yeah.
But there you go. I said at the time, 15 years ago, I'd like some of that. I still want some of that.
Have you ever
Oh, no.
Wow.
Because they won't want to use it off script, as they call it. You'd have to do do it properly.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Let's just very quickly have a look at spooks for hire in the Sunday Times. Benedict?
Well, this is in some ways quite an upbeat story because it means that there are former British servicemen getting into jobs into an area that was previously reserved for Russians and Israelis, as far as I'm aware. They were the predominant market pool from where the rich and famous used to hire their investigators and security. But this is what this is. It's about very wealthy people, very powerful people in organisations hiring spooks, former intelligence officers, that sort of thing, to spy on other people, to gather intelligence. The clue's in the name. And I think this is it's one of those things where I think a lot of people probably do suspect that it goes on, which is that people with that kind of money and who have reasons to sort of delve into the private lives of competitors and other people or people that they perceive as threats themselves would do that. But it's very interesting to sort of see that on the front page of the Times, sort of in black and white, that it is British people who are doing this and that it isn't some sort of shadowy foreign operative.
It's a dirty game, isn't it?
It is. But there's a lot of money to be made in it.
Oh,
I think
excellent.
actually, people would be surprised that there's very little money relatively in serving your country in these areas, but partly because you don't want to draw attention to the fact that you're a very highly trained spook. So actually, you're not going to be living the James Bond lifestyle with a fast car and a nice penthouse. That's not really how it works. So, post your career in service to your country, you need to go out and make a quick living. That's what you do. You find yourself an oligarch.
Yeah, well, fair dues. Make a few million quid.
I'm sure it's all perfectly
above board, yes. Benedict, Ella, thank you both very much.
Thank you very much.
We'll catch you a little bit later on.